Okay, hello everybody, good evening. We're here for part 3 of our discussion of rabbinic assessments of Herzl's role in Jewish history, a series which was sponsored by Doctors Saul and Rena Langerman in honor of their parents with the Tfilat Misha Ana Tonight's talk specifically is sponsored by Shimon and Chevy Marciano. And we also express gratitude to the Frankel family for facilitating the video taping of these talks. So tonight we're going to learn about two rabbinic responses from, we call it from Slobodka to Berlin, Rabbi Elia Kaplan and Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. Two responses of Rabbonim Gedolim, people who were great and unusual rabbinic personalities, who followed a specific path, and both of whom had published significant appreciations of Herzl. Both Rabbi Elia Kaplan and Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg were Talmidim of the Slobodka Yeshiva. They were students of Slobodka, and both of them, interestingly, went on to be the heads of the Rabbiner Seminar, the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin, which was a very important institution to develop and train Rabbanim and educators in the school of Rav Azriel Hildesheimer, in the school of German Jewry, influenced, of course, very significantly by Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, who was a colleague of Rav Azriel Hildesheimer, and there were sometimes some kinds of different flavors, but certainly there was a general flavor of German Orthodoxy that they both went to be to head. And one could be surprised that a Torah Derech Eretz institution of German Jewish nature should choose two people from the Eastern European world of the yeshivas from the Musar movement in order to make this happen. But in truth, it's not really such a big surprise, because it's well known that Rav Yisrael Salanter once, in fact, met with Rav Hirsch, and they had a talk through the night. It's recorded. The story is recorded in the Tnuas HaMusar. Rav Yisrael Salanter spearheaded the translation of the 19 letters of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch into other languages because he felt it was such a valuable text in order to be able to teach and to spread Torah. And of course, both Rav Yisrael Salanter, both the Musar movement and the Torah Derech Eretz movement of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, both of them represented movements that were there to make sure that what Torah produced was a great human being, that did not want simply a religious life that expressed itself as a religious life alone, just in the religious sectors, but as Torah Derech Eretz tells you to go and bring Torah, to apply it to the world at large, and that it should influence everything which you do and everywhere that you go. Of course, the Shita of Musar was essentially pursuing the same general kind of thing, the same general goal, to create a deeply, deeply refined person. And it's an interesting thing that it was bifnim and it was bachutz, it was inside and it was outside, which leads us to a certain degree to try to, help us look and to understand what were the nakudas, what were the points here of appreciation. So what I'm going to do with you tonight, Mir Hashem, is I'm going to try to share with you a little bit, in essence, some essential summary of the appreciation that Rav Elia Kaplan gave in 1919 in a talk which he gave in the town of Telz, not in the yeshiva of Telz, about Herzl. And another appreciation which was published actually more than once by Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg of Herzl. Years later, both of them are, of course, years after the passing of Herzl. And to try to frame it, there are two very different hespedim, there are two very different appreciations. However, to see that both of them are coming in a certain sense from the same school, from the same world. And let's start with an appreciation of of Slobodka. Slobodka had a shita, had a specific approach within the world of the schools of Musar. People know typically that there were two opposites. On the one end, on the one extreme, was Navardic, that spoke about the simplicity of the human being, the pedestrian nature of the human being. The human being comes from the earth, and a person always has to remember, Zachur ki afar anachnu, remember that we're from the dust, and the humble beginnings and the humble nature of the human being. Whereas by contrast, the derech, the way of Slobodka, was known as the way of Gadlus Adam, of the greatness of the person. Slobodka preached the Tselem Elikim, the image of God which was in each human being, and the tremendous potential which people had as a result of that, as something, as a bar set very high for people to live up to. That's why you would see in the true images, in general of the Musar movement, but especially of the Slobodka, you would see a tremendous dignity, a dignity of carriage, a dignity of the person that would be projected in many ways. Interesting that even to some degree in the external manifestations. I'll just show you a picture of Rabbi Avram Elia Kaplan. This was Rabbi Avram Elia Kaplan of Slobodka. Okay, so you see on him, you see the nice tall Litvische yarmulke, you see a Spitzboard, a Van Dyke, very, very elegant person, very, very elegant, very, very handsome person. What do you call that? A wingtip collar or something like that, where it's broken? Is that what it's called? And put together. And by the way, these were the kinds of pictures. It wasn't just Rabbi Avram Elia Kaplan of Berlin. These were the kinds of when you see images of the people of Kelm, of the Desslers. Not Rav Avram Elia Dessler, not the Rav Elio Dessler, the Michtam Elio, but who has more of what we would call a traditional rabbinic, yeshivish rabbinic appearance. But those that, otherwise, there was a very aristocratic presentation. Part of the cheshbon of the Baal Musar was very, very calculated and careful and neat and precise in everything, thoughtful, especially in the way of Kelm. And in Slobodka, there was this specific flavor of the great dignity, the dignity of a human being. Something, again, which is preached in the schools of Torah Derech Eretz in its own way. Rabbi Avram Elia Kaplan was a phenomenon. He was a phenomenon. In the yeshiva world, in the world of Slobodka and beyond, he was one of the Talmidim, one of the students who captured the hearts of the people around him. He was influential, arguably vying in influence in a certain sense with many others who were the formal leaders of the yeshivas and of the movements. And there are all kinds of in the volume which I'm holding in front of me, which is called Be'ikvos Hayira, which is a collection of pieces that were published from the writings of Rabbi Avram Elia Kaplan. They also have a section of a correspondence which was to him and about him. So I would just bring just one example here, which is a letter from Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, who wrote to his son about his father. He was, thanking him for a sefer which he had published from his father, and he says he remembers that when his father, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, was appointed as a Rav in Rasain, which was near Kovna, the Alter of Slobodka sent some of the Talmidim from Slobodka to learn Torah from him, and the people who came from Knesset Yisrael, from the Slobodka Yeshiva, he remembers as a child, he says, that they spoke with wonders about this person named Rabbi Avram Elia Kaplan, on his lamdus, his abilities in learning, yashra sichle, the sharpness and straight thinking which he had, havanosai habehira, the clarity of his understanding, signoinai, his style, noa midosav ahalichosav, the pleasantness of his character and the way he conducted himself. If my memory doesn't fail me, they also spoke about his neginos and his singing. Some of you may know it's stunning, but there's a nigun shaka chama that Shlomo Yehuda Rechnitz revived and added to, which is based on lyrics. The tune is an older tune, but the lyrics, which it's a heavy Musar tune from Rav Melech Kaplan, but it's just magnificent what he did with it to add words. Was really, really very, very beautiful. It's a nigun which I have a problem. I could listen to it for hours on end. It's really very, very beautiful. And Rav Yoshever writes about this and about how he had such a hashpah, how he had such an influence on religious life in Germany. Kol echad shenifgash imodai hisbasei mimenu v'yamaritzei umechabdei mitechiras haraimamus. Anybody who encountered him honored him so greatly. He was a legendary character. If you ever had a chance to speak to people, Slabodka or people like that, about Rabbi Avram was a legend. He became the head of the rabbinical seminary in Germany in 1920 when he was 30 years old, and he died suddenly when he was 34 years old. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky is widely reported to have said that he had a very creative derech halimud, that if he would have lived a full life, he would have revolutionized the derech halimud in the world of the yeshivas. That was what Rav Yaakov reportedly said. But he was an Adam Gadol Ma'id, with a very poetic soul, besides for being very, very brilliant, and a person with some daring. And here, again, in the town of Telz, he gave this talk, which is published in the Sefer B'ikvos Hayira, Al Herzl, with regard to Herzl. And I want to give you a flavor of what he says, and you will hear in it an appreciation of Herzl from a perspective of Slabodka. He didn't teach us the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. He didn't teach us halacha. He didn't teach us agada. He didn't teach us the wisdom of the Jewish people. He didn't teach us the ethics of Judaism. You know why? Because nobody ever taught them to him. He grew up in an environment that these things were not present in. But he did teach us to say two words in an environment, in a context, which until he came along, nobody had the nerve to say those words. And those two words were Ivri Anaichi. Ivri Anaichi. I'm a Jew. Ivri Anaichi, of course, that exact quote is from whom? From Yaina, right? When they asked him, where are you from, as he was there asleep in the bottom of the boat. Right? Ivri Anaichi. I'm an Ivri. I'm a Jew. I'm a Hebrew. He says he taught us to say those words. He says, now, you'll say, what do you mean he taught us to say those words? Rabbis always tell people to say, they'll wake you up in the middle of the night. They're going to say, who are you? What are you going to say? You're going to say, Ivri Anaichi, I'm a Jew. People stand at Bimas, he says, and they say, you should know you're a Jew. And people will write Sfarim, and they will tell you, a Jew has to know at the core of his essence, that's what he is, he's a Jew. He says, we all say that in Shul. We all say that in the Beis Medrash. But anytime we would wander out of it, when we would go into the world, what are we? We're a German Jew, we're a French Jew, we're a Polish Jew. There's always a qualifier on it. And the qualifier on it is, here we are, we're a people, and we're Jews, but we're guests, and we live someplace else. And we're dependent on someplace else. And we've spent our lives for the past thousands of years, at this point in time, 1800 years, when Rav Melech Kaplan was writing, we spent the past 1800 years being used to just trying to be able to make it, to find favor, to be tolerated, accepted by the countries in which we live. The hasagas, the aspirations of the Jew, was that they would let the Jew be able to somehow get out of the ghetto, be involved in society, indulge and allow. And that would be the great accomplishment that the person would be able to have. Herzl, he said, was the first person was the first person of all of them, religious, secular, who said, a Jew can stand up. A Jew can stand up in the world court, in the court of world opinion or of public opinion, and say, I'm a Jew, and I, as a Jew, as part of the Jewish people with a heritage, we have the right to be a nation of our own. We don't need you to accept us. We need you, instead, to just recognize the tzedek, the justice, which is the justice of our cause, and the justice which is our right. And he says the following thing. He says, why didn't anybody do this until Herzl? He says, tell me, let me ask you, I'll answer you with a question. He says, like Jews do. When there are hundreds of prisoners in a prison camp, and they're suffering from all kinds of difficulties, he says, why don't they call a meeting amongst themselves and say, let's talk about the difficulties of our situation? Because they say to themselves, what's it going to help? Who's going to listen? Do we have any ability to change anything? We're prisoners here. He says that was the thought of the Jewish people for all of the years, all of the centuries of our exile. What ability do we have? What control do we have? We're prisoners here. We're going to get together. We're going to try to decide what our future should be. This is the first person who thought such a thing, who made a congress of Jews to get together to talk about what we should do, was Herzl. He said, hey, 1 second, why is that? It says, Herzl came all of a sudden, Vikara, and he said, Asirim, prisoners, tzu, go. Those who are in the darkness, go, reveal yourselves. Where are your chains? Where are your shackles? They're already rusty. Go ahead. Shake your hands, and they'll fall away. Your shackles, they'll open up. The nation of Nebuchadnezzar that originally changed you and shackled you, the nation of Titus that put you in the ghettos, the nation of the inquisitor that put on your garments the yellow patch, they've lost their mastery, they've lost their control. Mesu kol ha'anoshim hamevakshim es nafshecha. All of the people who are trying to kill you, they died. And you're still sitting there. You're still lying on the prison bed. And you're imagining that you're still stuck in that situation. And so he said his goal was to come and not to go to the midas harachamim, not to go to the characteristic of mercy of the nations of the world. They should have mercy on us and give us equal rights, allow us to live in the world. No. But rather, he wanted to go to a different place. He wanted to go to the midas hadin shel ha'umas. He wanted to go to the sense of justice of the nations, to go to the court, to go to the world stage, to the place where the Jewish people could stand like the Jewish nation, not like Jews individually who want their rights, but the Jewish nation to demand its rights for its freedom and for its homeland. That was the idea that he saw in him and that he admired so much. Now, there's obviously a lot of painful irony in what he is saying. They're gone. The Babylonians were gone. The Romans were gone. The inquisitors were gone. But a very short time later, the yellow patch would be back. And this was not, even when he wrote it, he was writing it he said this in 1919. The period after the First World War was not a period of a love affair of the world with the Jews, of Eastern Europe, of Poland, of Russia, with the Jewish people. He did not have that sense. But the opposite, the sense that we are sort of like stuck here, it was a complete paradigm shift. It was a complete paradigm shift that he felt that Herzl was waking up and saying to the Jewish people, why are you just resigning yourselves to this? Why are you just getting used to this? Try another way. Try another way to be able to to somehow free yourselves, to go to rise up and to have something different. The essay is long. It continues, but this is the essential message of it. I will share with you, Emir Hashem, hopefully in a little bit, how he continues and how he wraps up. But let's stop for a moment here and think about the thing which he's admiring about Herzl specifically. In a certain sense, this is counter to what we are used to. He's saying the Jew should be able to stand up and say, this is who I am, and ask for his rights. The Jew should ask for his rights as a people. And this was what Rabbi Avraham Elia Kaplan was admiring about him. Think about it. Tzelem Elokim, the greatness of a human being, the greatness of a Jew, the golus situation that expects of the Jew to be subordinated, that expects of the Jew to be enslaved, to take it on the chin, to get used to everything, to get used not only to working for others or being the guests of others, but to be used to being taken advantage of by others, without any sense of justice or of recourse. Now, when your whole mahalach achayim, when your whole approach to the education of a human being, when what drives you is that you have to feel you have something that's great within you. You're a little Rabbi Shalailamul. You're the Tzelem Elokim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created you in his image. You have greatness, you have potential. How do you become so resigned? How do you become so humbled? The derech, the way of the Jewish people, that to some degree we didn't strive always for greatness, that he saw there was this sort of maybe a decrease in human potential that was expressed in the regular lives of the Jewish people. Doesn't this help to create it? We've shared many times from a different school of thought. We've shared many times that the Rav Menachem Zemba, it's recorded in one of the diaries, the diary of Hillel Zeidman from the Warsaw Ghetto, that Rav Menachem Zemba who was a Goyen Olam and was from Poland and was connected to the Rebbes of Ger, that he used to say a vort in the Warsaw Ghetto. He would say to people, and that was that it says that Moshe went out. It refers to the sivlois. He saw besivloisam. He saw the burdens of the Jewish people. That's the way we usually describe it in Mitzrayim. But the Chidushei Harim would say that sivlois is not just the burden. Sivlos is the things which we are sovel, the things which we tolerate. And he saw that the Jewish people, we were there in Mitzrayim, we were there in Egypt, and we tolerated the situation. We stopped striving, yearning, thinking that we could have much more. Slavery to the Egyptians, being taken advantage of and being beaten up, became just a normal mindset. And we weren't even struggling to get out. We didn't even have the aspirations to try to somehow cast away those chains and to become ourselves again, to become bigger and to become greater. That was the tragedy which Moshe Rabbeinu had to remedy. And Rabbi Nachum Zemba was saying that to the people around him, the horrible privation of the Warsaw Ghetto and the lowering of who could react any differently. That whole notion, that whole idea was counter to Slobodka. If I can share just a story, one of the great Talmidim of Slobodka that made a difference in America was Rav Hutner, Zichrono Livracha. And it's a funny story, but Rav Hutner was hijacked. He was on one of those planes which was hijacked in the early 70s to Jordan, and they sat there on a tarmac for a couple of days. Reportedly, one day, the hijackers came around and offered something, to the hungry people, the thirsty people. Came around with cans of soda, and they handed a can of soda to Rav Hutner, and he felt it, and he said, Varma Pepsi, a warm Pepsi, and he gave it back. Right? In other words, it's a funny story. It's a Rav Hutner story, but the idea is, there's a certain dignity of a human being, which is the last thing you want to surrender. I'm not a beggar. I'm not a beggar. I don't like this. I'm not having it. I'm not a beggar. As soon as I lower myself, then that whole world of hasagas, it disintegrates. And that was what was the state of mind of the Jewish people, certainly as Jews. Said Rav Avram Elia, look what this man has done. Look what this man has done. He's given Jewish people a sense that they don't have to live as beggars, but instead they can somehow be at their own table. That was the vision, this kavod ha'adam. Now it's an interesting thing, because when we hear that, we say, hold on, isn't that going against those shavuos, those oaths that it says in the end of the Gemara in Ksubas, that sugya which we alluded to before in our earlier discussions, where it would seem to say, the Jewish people are not supposed to rise up, we're not supposed to rebel against the nations of the world, we're supposed to be used to being humble in front of them, and not try to assert ourselves, and not to go up kachoma to Eretz Yisrael. Well, he actually alludes to this. When he gives his talk, he says, there are two forms of opposition to Herzl. One form of opposition is those who would, and Herzl had violent opposition, so to speak, not violent literally, but so to speak, from the people who said, what are you talking about? We're trying, we're working, we're making progress as being accepted by the society around us. So he spends a nice amount of time, Rav Avram Elia, talking about how hopeless that is, how history has proven time and time again that it doesn't work. We end up overstaying our welcome, we end up being resented, and we end up being rejected. That doesn't work. But he says, but on the other hand, there are others who would say that their opposition isn't because they want to be assimilated into the land, but instead they want to say that we shouldn't be taking the initiative to try to resolve this difficulty. Our job, rather, is to say that we should just do what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be Yehudim, be Jews, lishmar es haTorah, to observe the Torah, and we let the Rabbi Shalom, Hine lo yanav leishan shemer Yisrael, the watchman who guards the Jewish people's future, the Rabbi Shalom, he will not slumber, he will not sleep. The Rabbi Shalom is going to take care of it. So he says, look, in terms of the sugya of the shalosh shvuos, I'd love to discuss it, but this is not the place to discuss it. He was giving a lecture to the people of the town of Telz. I'm not going into lengthy halachic things, which I'm happy to discuss at some other time. So we don't have the privilege, the benefit of seeing what his response was to this. So we're left to speculate. And there are many different approaches to this. But one thing which is clear, what one could say, is that what he was doing, what he was lauding Herzl for doing, was not to raise arms in rebellion against the nations of the world. And it wasn't to go and to say, to assert ourselves to lord over them, but to ask, to demand justice. To demand justice. Demanding justice, he did not see as a stira. Golus can mean exile. Golus can mean that we're the conquered rather than free and sovereign, but it doesn't mean being taken advantage of necessarily. And the quest for mishpat, the quest for justice, he certainly did not see. Again, however, if that's the correct interpretation of the way he resolves it with the Gemara or not, but he did not see it at all as a violation of this idea of this trust. There was a kavod for the people that had to be restored. And I want to just share with you two things from the stories of Herzl that bear this out. The first one is not particularly spiritual, but it's, one might say, slabodka. One of my first ideas months ago, writes Herzl in his diary, on how the Congress should be conducted, this is the first Zionist Congress in Basel, was to have swallowtails and white tie obligatory at the opening session. Everyone had to come in a cutaway tails and a white bow tie. It worked out admirably. Full dress has a way of making most men feel rather stiff. The stiffness induces a measured, deliberate tone, one not so readily come by in light summer suits or travel wear, and I spared nothing to heighten this tone to the pitch of solemnity. Nordau, Max Nordau, who was a critical, important player, more well-known in certain ways than Herzl, turned up that first day in a frock coat and flatly refused to go home and put on his full dress. I drew him aside and begged him to do it for my sake. As of today, I told him, the Presidium of the Zionist Congress still amounts to nothing. We still have everything to create. People must be brought to expect only the finest things from the Congress and the utmost solemnity. He allowed himself to be persuaded, and I hugged him in gratitude. After a quarter of an hour, he returned in formal attire. He insisted that they had to come, and it had to be something which was dignified. More substantive is the following. Herzl starts keeping his diary as he starts to develop this dream. And his first real effort on behalf of Zionism was a visit to the Baron de Hirsch in Paris. The Baron de Hirsch was a very big philanthropist, supported Jewish things, Jewish causes, Jewish agricultural settlement in Argentina. He had all kinds of things going on, and Herzl knew that for his plan to take off, he would need support and he would need influence. So he said, "Here, I'm in Paris." He was the bureau chief for the Viennese newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse in Paris. "I'm going to go see the Baron de Hirsch." And he goes to see him, and he has this whole presentation, which he makes to him. And he speaks of it. And one of the points which he makes is a very, very interesting one. And it really is the idea that he was trying to speak of a whole different model, a different model than, for example, his establishment of agricultural colonies in Argentina, which was created based on charity and philanthropy, rather than really a self-sustaining business model. And his whole vision of what he wanted to create when he built the Jewish state was not that all the Jews will have to go there, but that Jews would go there, would choose to go there, would establish a great place that other Jews would want to come to. And they wouldn't be coming because of lack of choice. That would go against the whole notion of creating the dignity. Now he says as follows: "I propose to lay down quite different methods from those which you employ. First of all, there's the principle of philanthropy, which I hold to be altogether mistaken. You breed beggars. It is characteristic of the situation that no other people show so much philanthropy and so much beggary as the Jews. Plainly, there must be a close connection between these two phenomena. Philanthropy, it is apparent, debases the character of our people." A very interesting argument. Don't try it the next time somebody comes to ask you for some help. But the idea being that, sort of like we define these classes, and our generosity perhaps sometimes cultivates an expectation that others are going to be able to be taken care of. And what he wanted to do very strongly, he was trying to create this Jew that has a greater sense of themselves, a greater sense of Tzelem Elokim. You know what Ramchal teaches us about Tzelem Elokim? He teaches us first and foremost about Tzelem Elokim, that a person should be self-made, should be independent. The Rabbi Shalom is not dependent on anything. The Rabbi Shalom is the creator. He's not the created. And a human being, that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu created human beings with bechira, with free choice. So we shouldn't be dependent on the bread of shame, on the nama de kisufa of others. In our Parsha, it's Parshas B'chukaisei this week, and we have the bracha, and it says, "V'yashbar ma'taisulchem v'eilech eschem kaimemius." I will break the yokes of your burden, and I will make you travel kaimemius, standing tall. Rav Tzadok HaKohen, in the Sefer Yisrael Kedoshim, has the following note. He says, we'll go to Eretz Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Everybody knows the expression, V'selichenu kaimemius le'artzeinu. Right? We say it every morning in Birchas Kriyas Shema. Take us upright to our land. He said, Loi ke'elu hanaisim hayom le'eretz hakodesh liyos sham b'shiflus Uvagolus bein ha'amim hamoshlim sham. Rav Tzadok wrote this in the late 19th century. Not like those who travel today to Eretz Yisrael, to be there humbly and in golus in the hands of the nations who rule there. De'ein mizeh chazor l'artzeinu l'kedushaseinu b'poel. Right? He was worried both about the fact that they were under other nations and that they were dependent always on chalukah. They were dependent on charity. He says that's not kaimamius. That's not kaimamius. There's in Yiddish the word for it is a stolz, a poise and a strength which is slabotker, which is tzelem aleikim, which is kaimamius la'artzeinu, which Rav Avram Elia Kaplan deeply appreciated that Herzl was restoring to the Jewish people. That sense of pride, that sense of dignity, that would be part and parcel of this return to Eretz Yisrael, this return to freedom. He ends, and it's very important to say this, he ends and he says, so you'll say, again, Rabbi Hashem should take care of us. It's not for us to plan. Hinei lo yonav elisha shemer Yisrael. And Rabbi Avram says, tell me something. I agree with you 100%. Anybody who looks at the history of the Jewish people and everything we went through, we see that the Rabbi Shalom is always there, always involved, always taking care of us. Otherwise, there's no way to explain how we made it through all of this, how we survived, how we make it to this point. But I posit, says Rabbi Avram, that where do you think this spirit that has somehow come into the Jewish people, into people who are far away from the Torah, this pride in being Jews and the saying, let's go and restore ourselves, where do you think that came from? Said Rabbi Avram, there's only one place where I think this comes from. This is Yoda Hanistora Shel HaHashgacha. This is the hidden hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Hashgacha, stirring and bringing a spirit of revival to the hearts of Jews. And he says, V'odeyani, and I'm confident that the same way that this sense of urgency for independence has come into the spirit of renewal of the Jewish nation, Kein Machracha Tia Lavoi Seif Kol Seif, it is so absolutely necessary, it will necessarily happen ultimately, but Asid HaBilti Nireh La'ayin, in a future that we don't see yet, there will be also Tchias Ruach Teraseinu. The spirit of our Torah will also be revived in the hearts of people. This is all part of a divinely inspired revival of the spirit of the Jewish people. This is the way. This is the way he saw it, and he goes on and says, "V'alekim asher yeshivenu l'tzion," the God who will return us to Tzion, yeshivenu gam l'Torah mitzion, will also return us also to a Torah from Tzion. Ani mamin, I believe. And he ends with a line that he says, and to the extent that my faith in God grows, my connection to the movement of Tzionus grows. That's how Rabbi Avram Elia Kaplan ended this thing. He saw this as the way, the path. We spoke about Shliach Hashem or Maseh Satan. He saw this as a divinely inspired movement, strengthening the connection of Jews to Eretz Yisrael, to be proud of themselves and to be proud in their connection to the Jewish people. That's the story, so to speak. That's Avram Elia Kaplan's Slabodker aspect. But it's really not the end, and I want to share something, and I want to acknowledge that I got this Maramokum actually from our son, Yisachar, who found this a piece from Rav Yechiel Michal Schlesinger, who was the founder of Yeshivas Kol Torah, and was himself a student of Rabbi Avram Elia Kaplan in Berlin, and a piece of his was published in the journal Yeshurun, number 29. And he tells about a conversation which was taking place in the yeshiva, and they were debating and talking about this aspect or that aspect of Zionism. And he says that Rabbi Avram Elia Kaplan interjected, because they were talking about the question, which we've discussed earlier in the series, which is at the core of any rabbinic assessment of Herzl, is, so how does this happen, that this should happen through the hands of someone who is so assimilated, so far away from Torah and from Jewish life and from Jewish tradition? How could it be that this would come through his hands? And Rabbi Avram Elia said to them the following thing. He says, it's not coming from the sinners, it's coming from them despite the fact that they have pshoim as well, al af pisheim. And his perspective was that you have to understand, these are Yidden, these are Jews, and Jews at the core is al kippah Yisrael heim. These are Jews. This is not being done by their averis. This is being done despite their averis. There's a Jewish spirit, a high spirit, etzelem Elokim, that moves them, that gets them to do these things. Yes, it could sometimes get clouded by things which they don't have quite straight in their lives. But don't look at this and say, this must be a terrible thing because it's coming from sinners. The opposite. Look at it. It's a great thing. It's coming from Jews. You're seeing some complicated, terrible things happening to it. You see that despite that overlay, there's still something good at the core which is being seen, which is being created there. And I would say to you, I think this is also at the core a Slabodka perspective. The Slabodka perspective of Tzelem Elohim understands at the core the greatness of the human being, and therefore sees that when there are failures, those failures, they're there on the surface. The person is confused, is mixed up. As the Maharal famously says in his Drasha L'Shabbos Shuva, Yom Kippurim kapara is wiping off the grimy surface, because really what's there underneath would gleam if we would just wipe off the grimy surface. And that was the way he taught, and he recalled it to his Talmidim. And that perspective comes across in a great sense, most sharply, in the words which Rabbi Chil Yaakov Weinberg said about Herzl. And his piece about Herzl was called Herzl Ish Hados, Herzl the man of religion. That's what his piece is about. Herzl, the assimilated Jew, the man of religion. It's a beautiful piece. It's an interesting piece. It's littered as well with anecdotes about different things that Herzl did, which were actually touching and connecting to Yahadus. He recalls the story which is told, which Herzl himself wrote about, and is published in some of the editions, less edited editions of his diary, where he writes, did we talk here about the aliyah that he got when he went for the first Zionist Congress? So on the Shabbos, it was starting on Sunday, on the Shabbos in Basel, in deference to religious considerations, I went to synagogue on Saturday before the Congress. The head of the congregation called me up to the Torah. I had the brother-in-law of my Paris friend, Beer, was one of his friends who was religious, Mr. Marcus of Miran, drilled the bracha into me. And then I climbed the steps to the altar. I was more excited than on all the Congress days. The few Hebrew words of the bracha caused me more emotion than my welcoming and closing address and the whole direction of the proceedings. Rabbi Chil Yaakov Weinberg writes about how he heard from a rabbi who was an anti-Tzioni, who was there in Basel, that when Herzl was called up to the Torah for the Aliyah, everyone was crying. Everyone was crying. A story, an illustration. He writes about a meeting, which Mirat Hashem will perhaps start with next time, that he had in Vilna, when Herzl visited Vilna, and he was presented with a Sefer Torah by the Cheshek Shloima, by the Dayan of Vilna. He writes about moments of connection. One of those moments of connection is that of what some people call amongst the unforgivable sins of Herzl. What do I mean? What is that referring to? The unforgivable sins of Herzl. So there are some. Uganda, unforgivable sin. That passage where he writes that when he was first trying to consider the issues of the Jewish people, so one of the thoughts which he had was that they would all go and be baptized in the church. He writes it in his diary. And then he writes that he writes it as a Havamin, and there's no other record of it other than when he writes about it as this thought which he has. And then he says that his editor said to him, "For 100 generations your race has clung fast to Judaism. You're proposing now to set yourself up as the man to end this stand. This you cannot do and have no right to do." And he accepted it. And then he decided to build something very different. And remember that Herzl said that very interesting statement, which could have been on some level diplomatic, but it seems became much more than that, was that he said at the First Zionist Congress that Zionism is a return to Judaism before it is a return to the land of the Jews. Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg brings episodes like this, statements like this, to point to an idea that Herzl was fundamentally tapping into a movement of the spirit. And whatever it started off as, which was a frustration with the chronic anti-Semitism, with the difficulty of a Jew being able to make it, a problem which an assimilated Jew might be the most profoundly troubled by when he sees a fellow assimilated Jew, Colonel Dreyfus, being court-martialed and being treated the way he was treated. You could be a decorated army veteran. It doesn't make a difference. The Jews never find their way at home. And find whatever solution. Let's try to find. But in the end, he came to rally the Jewish people. And as was expressed by others, in rallying the Jewish people, he discovered that there was something much more to this. And he began strongly to connect to it. So I started saying of the unforgivable sins. One of the famous unforgivable sins of Herzl was something which was discovered by one of the chief rabbis who Herzl tried to win over, and who came to speak to Herzl, to meet with Herzl, and he came to visit Herzl in his house in December. And he came to the house, and what did he find? He found Herzl's house with a tree inside the house in December. And he lost it. That was it. This was, he was criticized, certainly early on, and even about the Jewish state, about the absence of enough of a religious motif in it. And this assimilated Jew, look what he's trying to do. This man celebrates the other holidays. Okay, so whether it was a Christian celebration or whether it was Viennese aristocracy or French aristocracy, and that was the kind of things which they had. But that did happen. But Herzl himself wrote an essay in 1897, which is already a couple of years later, and the essay is called The Menorah. And the Menorah is, with this essay, I'm going to read to you just snatches of it. Once there was a man who deep in his soul felt the need to be a Jew. His material circumstances were satisfactory enough. He was making an adequate living and was fortunate enough to have a vocation in which he could create according to the impulses of his heart. You see, he was an artist. He had long ceased to trouble his head about his Jewish origin or about the faith of his fathers, when the age-old hatred reasserted itself under a fashionable slogan. Like many others, our man, too, believed that this movement would soon subside, but instead of getting better, it got worse. Although he was not personally affected by them, the attacks pained him anew each time. Gradually, his soul became one bleeding wound. And he goes on about the torment of the Jewishness being the source of all of this anguish, with the result that he experienced a change that he might never have in better days because he had become so alienated. He began to love Judaism with great fervor. At first, he did not fully acknowledge this mysterious affection, but finally it grew so powerful that his vague feelings crystallized into a clear idea to which he gave voice. The thought that there was only one way out of this Jewish suffering, namely, to return to Judaism. When his best friends, whose situation was similar to his, found out about this, they shook their heads and thought that he had gone out of his mind. And he goes on and writes about this. In previous years, he had let the festival, which for centuries had illuminated the marvel of the Maccabees with the glow of candles, pass by unobserved. Now, however, he used it as an occasion to provide his children with a beautiful memory for the future. An attachment to the ancient nation was to be instilled early in these young souls. A menorah was acquired, and when he held this 9-branched candelabrum in his hands for the first time, a strange mood came over him. In his remote youth in his father's house, such little lights had burned, and there was something intimate and homelike about the holiday. The tradition did not seem chill or dead. The custom of kindling one light with another had been passed on through the ages. And he goes on to describe how he did it, how he continued to light the menorah, candle after candle. When he had resolved to return to the ancient fold and openly acknowledged his return, he had only intended to do what he considered honorable and sensible. But he had never dreamed that on his way back home he would also find gratification for his longing for beauty. The essay of Herzl is the essay of a Baal Tshuva. And Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg in his essay says, he refers to him as a Baal Tshuva, a person who came from very far away, was faced with a technical problem of the survival of the Jewish people, something which he approached with a secular strategy. His strategy for building the Jewish state was a secular strategy. It is true that in the Jewish state, in the book, he says that there will be an absolute separation of church and state, that the rabbis will be kept to the synagogues, like the soldiers are kept to the barracks. But soldiers aren't imprisoned in the barracks. It's important to have an army. It's just that the army doesn't run the government. And that was what he was talking about, the structure of his state. And he didn't want religion to run the government. That was the structure. That was what he had in mind. That was what he intended to create. He wasn't a quote unquote, a pious chassid who was looking for it. His heir, just this week in Eretz Yisrael, was the statement which was made by, as the government was dissolved. This is not going to be a halachic state. Those were the words, this week of the person who brought down the possibility of making the government because of his tensions with the Haredim. This is not going to be a halachic state. And those are words of Herzl. It's not a great thing. It's not a positive thing. But at the same time, what moved him, what he tapped into ultimately, and what he realized, anything that's to galvanize the spirit of the Jewish people to rise up, is a sense of ruach, a sense of das, a sense of faith, of religion, of something. And here, I want to just read to you, and in a sense, close by reading to you what Herzl wrote to Baron de Hirsch on June 3rd of 1895, after his failed meeting with him. He says as follows: "The pen is a power. You will be convinced of it if I remain alive and in health, a reservation for which you too must make with regard to your own work. You are the great money Jew. I am the Jew of the Spirit. Hence the difference in our means and approach. Please note that you could not have heard of my experiments, for I have just made the first of them with you and on you. I am on my way. You are the money Jew, and I am Jew of the Spirit. Men live and die for a flag. A flag? What is that? You would have asked in mockery. A stick with a cloth rag? No, a flag, sir, is more than that. With a flag you can lead men where you will, even into the promised land. Men live and die for a flag. It is indeed the only thing for which they are willing to die in masses, provided one educates them to it. What you do not understand and imponderable? What then is religion? Consider, if you will, what the Jews have withstood throughout the 2,000 years for the sake of a vision. Visions alone grip the souls of men, and whoever does not know how to deal in visions may be an excellent, worthy, practical-minded person, and even a benefactor in a big way. but he will never be a leader of men, and no trace of him will remain. Ish Hados, a man of faith, a man of religion, a man of, by his own description, a man of spirit, not simply of practicality. Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg writes about how there was a kesem, there was a magic spell, so to speak, with the name Herzl cast over people. He says even those who were opposed to Zionism did not want to say anything. They didn't invoke Herzl's name in the critical sentences because he had ignited such a sense of spirit in people. He didn't do it simply as a dour, dry secularist. He had to capture the hearts of people. And he captured the hearts of people, not simply, it didn't just simply come as here, as it was beginning to develop, as a movement of spirit, but one which ultimately plugged back in to the spirit of Yahadus. I mentioned to you, to some of you at least, that Herzl's son, who again, another one of his unforgivable sins, quote unquote, so to speak, was the end of his children, which was not good and was not true as his child, his oldest child, baptized. But part of it was because of a trauma that he described that he experienced. What was the trauma? The trauma was he had a bris when he was bar mitzvah in 1905. Meaning that Herzl, the more he was, and that's right before his death, the more he was getting involved with the movement, right? When the child was born, 1892, no bris. He was an assimilated Viennese Jew. But now, child's going to have a bar mitzvah. Child's going to have a bris at that age. And so a spirit has to be touched if somebody's going to be leading the Jewish people back to Eretz Yisrael. If somebody's going to be capturing the hearts of Jews on all ends of Klal Yisrael, not just the communists who wanted to get out of this place or that place, but the Jews who wanted to return to Eretz Yisrael. It touches your soul and it has to touch others. I'll just end with a word that I saw from Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Charlap, who was a Talmud and a chaver of Rav Kook. He was a chavrusa and was to succeed Rav Kook, perhaps as the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, but instead Rav Herzog was brought in. Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap says on this week's parsha, "V'zacharti es brisi Yaakov, v'af es brisi Yitzchak, v'af es brisi Avram eskar, v'aretz eskar." So he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu remembers Jews and their strength. Yaakov was already emes, Torah, the fully developed Jew. Hashem says, I'll remember that. But even if there's nothing around to remind me of that, v'af es brisi Yitzchak, I'll remember the Yitzchak Jews. What's Yitzchak? Yitzchak is the person who's ready to be Meiser Nefesh for the Rabbanu Shalom. And you know, there were lots of Jews who were very incomplete. But when it came time to make a decision about Mesiras Nefesh, they were there and they were ready and they were Moser Nefesh. V'af es brisi Yitzchak. And then there are those who aren't even the Yitzchak Jews, but they demonstrate the generosity, which is characteristic of a Jew, a child of Avram. That's brisi Avram eskar. He says, and even if I don't find those, va'aretz eskar. Says Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, those Jews who say, you know, we have to restore the Jewish people to their land. We have to restore the Jewish land to the people. Even if they don't have brisi Yaakov, even if they don't have brisi Yitzchak, even if they don't have brisi Avram, but the notion of coming back to restore a home for the Jewish people, that's also an article of faith. It sometimes is covered over by all kinds of layers of other things, but it's also an expression of faith and of connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This was what this Slabodker saw. A movement like this is a movement of the spirit. Rav Avram Elia Kaplan said, a movement like this is a movement of the kavod, of the dignity of the Jewish people, of the Jewish person. Rav Yaakov Weinberg said, it's a movement, it's an expression of the spirit that's there in every Jewish person. Both of them saw Herzl as engineering a revival of those elements. Ru'uyim hadvorim lemisha amorum. These are hespedim which speak from the values that these people themselves possessed and that they admired, with all the complexity in this person who was playing such an important role in the Shivas Siyain, in the return to Eretz Yisrael, which is the gift of our time. Thank you very much.